Okay, now I'm going to run through some similar steps here now. I just have a piece of text and I'm going to do or create an animator, and this time what I'll do is I'll animate the rotation, and I'll just rotate it around its z-axis. Now by default I have a range selector, and the range selector is covering all of my text here. That's fine. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a second type of selector called a wiggly selector. I'm going to be saying wiggly a lot for the rest of the class, so just get used to it. So this wiggly selector is used in conjunction with this range selector to create randomized motion. So the range selector is a very controlled way of moving the effect of a change from left to right, right to left, or making the whole thing or just one word selected. Now when you have an animator, you can add a selector. I added a second range selector previously. This time I'm going to add a wiggly inspector or selector. Now what the wiggly selector does is it randomizes motion and it oscillates between random values. So if I play this just after applying it and not changing anything about this wiggly selector, you'll see that it starts to kind of move backwards and forwards. Now this is done. First of all, the mode is set to intersect, so it's intersecting with everything. So in this case my range selector covers everything, and the wiggly selector works by intersecting with that range. So everything within that initial range selector is intersecting with what the wiggly selector is doing. So you don't actually need to change that for the most part. Now max amount and min amount are saying, okay, well, when it's oscillating towards the change in property, do you want it to change all of the way, in which case the max amount will be set to 100, and when you want it to wiggle or oscillate back to the other direction, do you want it to go all the way into a negative value of that property, in which case minus 100 will be selected. So 100 and minus 100 are default ways of saying wiggle between the two extremities of that property change that you've created. Base it on characters. Yes, you can change that again to words or even lines. Characters for the most part, so I'm going to leave it at that. Now the wiggles per second is how many times it oscillates between these two random values. You can change that to a higher value, and they will basically wiggle faster. So you can see why they're called the wiggly selector. Now correlation means, do you want them to be completely when each one wiggles between two values, do you want the one next to it to be at a similar value, or do you want them to look really random and chaotic? If you want them to be random and chaotic, you set the correlation to 0, and you'll see that they get very kind of jittery and erratic. If you change it to 60, you'll see that they start to correlate with each other a little bit more, and if you set it to 100, you'll see that they actually all pretty much correlate or match up with each other in terms of each consecutive one going in the same direction. Now these are the important ones. I'm going to leave temporal and spatial phase alone for the moment. I might come back to that at a later time. And random seed. They're for when you're really fine-tuning this kind of an effect. So this is the wiggly selector. I'll change the correlation back to 0 so that they don't match up. Now if on the other hand you wanted to create some sort of an effect where you want to have a random end value, and you want to move from normal text to a random variation on a particular property, rotation in this case, then you set the wiggles per second to 1. You'll see that, to 0. You'll see that because there are no wiggles per second, it doesn't oscillate. It just sets a kind of a series of random values in between your original value, or not rotated, and your end value, which is a rotation of 36 degrees. So I'll up that now, actually, just to get a bit more of a random effect. Now, this is going to randomize the rotation properties of my text, but they're not going to oscillate, or they're not going to move back and forth between those different values. Now, the way that you control this effect is to use your max and your min amount. So the way that I would go from normal text to randomly scattered text is I change the max and the min to 0% or 0% of change, and when you have it set to 0% of change, you just have your original value. You can keyframe those. A little bit further down the timeline, I can push them back up to 100 and down to minus 100. What that will do is it will keyframe from no change to full change. Okay, so no wiggles means that you can use the max and the min amount to just randomize them at a point in the timeline. Now, I could still up that and it will kind of go from still no change to starting off a very random oscillating movement. So there's lots of ways that you can play with these. Now, to answer your question, Phil, yes, you can animate these in 3D space per character, which is actually quite important in that you can't get into the character's 3D axes in any other way in After Effects. So as opposed to changing it up here with your little cube icon, this time you go back into your animate and you go enable per character 3D. Now when you do that, you'll see that there's a new set, or you should actually, maybe you need to do this before you set your changes. You should see an extra set of parameters pop up. Now I'll just highlight the animator and go enable per character 3D. No, what I would have to do is change it before I put my animator down. So I'll delete that, go up to enable per character 3D, and when I add a rotation change this time, I have my X, my Y, and my Z. Okay, so this time what I can do is I can go into this, I can add a new selector, wiggly selector. I can change the wiggles per second to 4, bring the correlation down to 0, and let's say I want to rotate around my Y. Or if I wanted to do something very kind of odd looking, I could rotate 1 revolution in around each of my axes. I'll slow that down to back to 2 per second. Now what you do need to do before you animate around your X, Y, and Z axes in terms of rotation, you may need to adjust the anchor point. Now you'll see that when this does its thing, it takes the bottom of the text as the center point or the anchor point. So you can change that by creating an animator that just changes the anchor point and pushing it up above animator 1, so that the first thing that happens to this text when it's animated is that the text's anchor point is changed to be in the center of the text, and then you can see it animating around its center point. So that's the Wiggly inspector. Now just to recap on something there, you can have as many animators as you want, and if you want to separate what is happening to a particular piece of text in terms of a property change, then you may need to create 2 animators. But if you only want to change what's happening to one particular part of your text at any given time, you can add a property to any of these selectors that you've already created. So for my wiggly inspector here, animator 1, I can go up to add and I can change scale here now. And by changing scale, I can create an even more kind of off the wall looking animation. Now you can see how fast or how easy and quick it is just to play with these, to prototype something, to see how it looks, and then go, right, that's how I would make this kind of a look. Because what I'm going to get you to do at the end of the class is it's another kind of anthropomorphic exercise where I've given you a load of sentences and you have to make text loud, quiet, jittery, nervous, all these things, and there's lots of ways that you can do it just by using the wiggly and the range selectors in conjunction with each other.